Okay, I can hear a lot of background noise. I don't know if it's in the studio or not, but well, welcome to today's webcast. It's our last in a series of 3 webcasts that we've had on the topic of dysfunctional, abusive behavior in the workplace. And we've tried to look at it from the perspective of what organizations can do, what boards can do, and what senior leaders can do to stop what is a very timely topic, but one that has been with us for a very long time, and one that we hope we can help companies think about what they can do to make sure that we see the end of this kind of behavior in the workplace. A couple of things that I might just mention is that this is, of course, the third and final one. The first 2 that we have had are now available on demand, as this one will be within 48 hours. And I'd like to spend a few moments sort of recapping some of the key concepts that were discussed, and then I'm going to use most of the time to tap the wisdom and expertise of some outstanding panelists today who are going to be with me, and we'll introduce them in just a moment. Before we get started, let me just share with you a few housekeeping things. You certainly can ask questions by using the chat box in the bottom left of your screen. You can adjust the size, and you can see the 4 arrows in the upper right-hand corner, and that will help you adjust the size of the screen so that you're comfortable. There is a brief evaluation at the end of the webcast. We do take these things very seriously, and we would love your thoughts as to how we can do a more effective job, or to be more on point, or to continue our improvement process. And we hope you'll take just a couple of moments to answer those as well. And I would hope that you would share this with your colleagues and with others that you know who might be interested in this topic or might find it helpful. All 3 will be on demand. It is in the public domain, and it will be something that everyone can take advantage of. And I hope you'll share with others if you find this valuable. There are opportunities for continuing education credit. If you can, as you see here in the box, it says request credits. Please put your name and email address and specify whether or not you want HRCI or SHRM credits. And also, if you choose to qualify for the CPE credits, you will need to respond OK 3 times during the broadcast. So when you see the pop-up box, just click to show them that you're not a robot. So let me begin by saying that this is a topic that no series of relatively short webcasts will completely address everything. But I do hope that in the course of these webcasts, there have been things that have been helpful and that can spur some of the conversations that you'll need to have with senior leaders in your own organization. Here's what we're going to cover today. As I mentioned, I'm going to recap just ever so briefly some of the concepts that were shared in the first 2 webcasts, particularly why this is a business issue, what the organization's role is, and what the board oversight should be. Then I'm going to tap one of our panelists to talk about the importance of building a speak-up culture, and also about how leaders can be held accountable. And then we have an opportunity to hear from 2 of the panelists around some of the great work that was done and is being done at some companies, particularly from Marta in Atlanta and the Southern Company as well, and I'll make the introductions in a moment. And then I'm going to ask one of our panelists to share some examples of leadership in action, and then we're going to throw the discussion open to you. And my hope is that you'll ask some kinds of questions that'll further our discussion. So that's what we have planned for today. So let me just take you through very quickly where we have been. The first webcast, which was originally aired on the 5th of March, was one which our President and CEO of the Conference Board, John Spector, had a conversation with Stephen Paskoff. And Stephen has been the founder, president, and CEO of Eli for, I won't say quite how many years, but a long time. This is a man who knows what he's doing, and this is a man who spends a great deal of time talking to intact C-suite groups. I first met Steve and the team at Eli when I was a chief talent officer, and benefited greatly from some of the thinking here. So in that first webcast, they talked a lot about the news. You can't escape it, and this is not meant to be representative of all instances where in the news there's been some allegations of inappropriate and abusive or dysfunctional behavior in the workplace. And it touches everything, media to entertainment, to the corporate setting, to not-for-profits, to government agencies. There's certainly no end to the number of of individuals and companies that have been swept up in recent times. And one of the things Steve brought out was that these organizations behind all these headlines had many things in common. Most likely, they had very strong value statements and policies. They had ways for people to bring complaints forward. They had training programs. They had compliance structures. What they probably also had in common was that there was an organizational culture that failed to really support the processes that were in place. They either ignored or excused behavior, or they enabled abusive leaders. And they probably had leaders who ignored these standards or felt that they were above the standards or above the regulations or above the rules. And they failed to speak up and act when they saw other things happening in the workplace. So it's a great deal more than simply having processes and procedures and the ability to use a hotline. There's an organizational culture that needs to support this and take specific action. You know, it's important to do this because it is a critical business issue, and you can see the range of impacts that it can have when it's not done. Certainly, there's the inability to drive the business and to stay focused on the mission and supporting customers and in looking for new and innovative ways to succeed. And when you have to spend time, or a board has to spend time in particular, on issues like this, it does not have the bandwidth to then continue the great progress toward strategic decisions. So there's opportunity cost. Certainly there's reduced shareholder value, and there could very well be many other impacts like reputational damage, which could be very, very difficult to overcome. One of the other things that was stressed in this particular webcast was how prevalent this is in all parts of the world, and headlines and examples abound from a variety of sources, and again, in a government context, in a corporate context, in not-for-profit and government agencies. And what was so important, I thought, in this webcast was the question around how do you build a speak-up culture? How do you encourage employees to understand that not only do they have the opportunity, but that they should and that they must? And later today, we'll talk a little bit about some of the important elements of a speak-up culture and how to build it. The second in the series was one done specifically about board oversight and the role of the board in stopping this abusive and dysfunctional behavior. It was hosted by Doug Cha, who is our Executive Director of the Corporate Governance Center here at the Conference Board, and he was joined by two partners from Cleary Gottlieb, Jennifer Kennedy Park, and Kimberly Sperry. So there's a great wealth of information in that webcast, and I'll touch on just a couple of things. So when it talks about the board communication, a couple of key points here. One, certainly it needs to send the message that it's the tone at the top that is sent, like it is with everything else, but that sexual harassment or other types of abusive behavior is not acceptable. And they also need to see in that third bullet that instances of sexual harassment or other examples of abusive behavior, because that could run the gamut between sexual harassment and simply rude and unprofessional behavior, but they need to see that the board takes things seriously and that they do take action on complaints that are escalated. Another key point here is about board refreshment and bringing on new members of the board. They may bring new perspectives, they may be perceived as more independent, and they may also be in a position to ask the kinds of questions that spur the board and also senior management into action. And I thought that that was a key takeaway. Something else that the boards can also consider doing is looking at compensation programs, looking at clawback provisions, or looking at other ways in which the violation of a contract in terms of cause might trigger actions that the board can take. Certainly training for senior levels of management and also for all employees about how to report violations and what, in essence, constitutes the way in which we will do business here in this setting. And finally, in hiring, to have a better understanding of what someone's background is before hiring. I recognize that non-disclosure agreements make a full and very thorough impression of a candidate sometimes difficult, but I think that there are many conversations going on now that may help to make that less of an issue in the future. But again, a great webcast on demand and available for you. So let me now turn to introducing the members of the panel that I have the privilege to be with today. The first I'd like to mention is Dr. Sheldon Good, who, as you can see, is with the Metropolitan Atlanta Rapid Transit Authority. And he brings a wealth of education, outreach, and also corporate experience, either at the Southern Company prior to this, Pennsylvania Power of Light, Oshkosh. He has been instrumental in helping people complete their doctorates. He himself holds a doctorate in public administration from the University of Alabama. I am a proud Florida graduate, sir, and I hope we can get past this and still have a good webcast today. That is my hope. That is my hope. He's also a highly decorated Air Force veteran. Thank you for your service. We're also joined by David Ratliff, who is the retired chairman, president, and CEO of the Southern Company. And he has a wealth of experience in the utilities industry in particular, having served earlier as the CEO of Georgia Power and of Mississippi Power. He is also the past chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. He has served on the boards of several different organizations, including CSX Transportation, and also the Center for Civil and Human Rights and the Center for Disease Control Foundation, both in Atlanta. Thank you very much, David, for choosing to join with us today as well. And then last but not least is my colleague, Stephen Paskoff, with whom I have partnered on many things over the years. He has been a touchstone and an expert in so many different areas, and he also brings a wealth of experience. He spends a lot of time, as I mentioned, working with corporations very candidly and very discreetly with C-suite groups, helping them understand some of the nuances of the law. He certainly brings the law to the table. He's a former EEOC trial attorney. But I think what I've always appreciated about Stephen is that he not only looks at the law of things, but he looks at the spirit of things. And that's where I think he has very robust conversations with many of us. So, gentlemen, thank you. Thank you all very, very much for helping to make this webcast today. Steve, I wonder if we could begin with you to recap just a little bit on the importance of that speak up culture and how it's done. I'll be happy to advance the slides for you when we need to.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, David and Shelton. I'm honored to be with them and with you. And I'm glad that the title today is the importance of building an inclusive speak up culture. I'm glad that there's not another word in the title, which I'm going to say anyway, which is compliance. And I want to say what is important about focusing on inclusion, speak up, and culture, and building all of that together. Now, if you take a look at virtually every story in the news, starting with what triggered much of this, which was the Harvey Weinstein situation and the others on the prior slide that you pictured, what you'll find out is all of those organizations had one form or another of policy and stated values. They had training, they had compliance structures, they had hotlines, all sorts of other issues. And the question I've raised to groups is, how could this happen when they had all those systems in place? And what they didn't have were inclusive speak-up cultures. They had systems and policies and practices, but what they didn't have is a day-to-day way of doing things that got people to recognize how important it was to encourage people to speak up and for people to do that and know that their issues and concerns would be answered. I learned this, the cultural issues, almost 26 years ago. I was asked to work with a major nuclear utility, not involving the Southern Company, in another portion of the United States, that had problems. They were about as compliance-driven as you can imagine, had every policy you could think of. And yet people would not go in and speak to their leaders at any level with the frequency they needed when they were dealing with nuclear safety concerns. They knew there were systems, they just didn't trust them and they were afraid. And here's what they did. They either did nothing, which is a hazard, went to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission or the Labor Department, or hired a lawyer, which was their right, but it slowed the process of assessing a problem and promptly fixing it. And the problem was their culture was broken. And the culture did not encourage people to speak up. And it took a lot to work with them to fix that. Now, what is the structural formula for changing culture? Rebecca, if you'd move forward. The next slide, please. Basically, what I think and would suggest is important if you want to build an inclusive culture from a conceptual point of view, where people will speak up, is illustrated by this diagram. Commitment is at the center, and that means the senior leadership, middle-level executives and leaders and supervisors, ultimately everyone, have got to recognize that they have an ownership responsibility in terms of getting people to recognize the importance not only of proper behavior, running the whole gamut of things you mentioned, Rebecca, but also their responsibility to speak up when there are problems and to feel confident that they will be listened to and not ignored, retaliated against, or otherwise harmed. That is hard, and it's really difficult to get people to believe in that, no matter what you say your systems are. That requires leadership at the top. I've worked with Shelton, and I've heard great stories about David that span many years, that what they do and what they've had in common, among other things, is an ability to say, we mean it, I want you and my team to mean it, and I want your teams and their teams to mean it, because this is not something that we can ignore. And having a culture where people will speak up about ideas and about problems is vital to our business success, and it's vital to our sustaining a safe and efficient operation. That is absolutely critical. Now, in addition to that, you need to have communication. That means that your messages need to be communicated, not just with PR or HR statements or legal statements. You can have posters, they're important. You can have other emails and videos, they're important. But leaders at every level need to integrate their commitment to getting people to speak up about issues as regularly as they do safety and other operational concerns. And the communication has got to be meaningful. I've been in many organizations that have these wonderful posters, but they're fluff. You walk by and you never even stop and think about them. That is not effective communication. And it's not effective communication when a leader talks about a message once a year, says we're covered, let's move on, or reads something that doesn't come across as legitimate as a safety or an operational or business concern. Right. You've got to have content. Content means, yes, you've got to have policies, systems, and quite often that's where people start and stop, and it's not enough. Consequences are absolutely critical. I have seen leaders say this is important, but their actions show it's important unless it involves a big producer, somebody who's in a senior job, some money, some potential kickback from others in the organization. And when you don't enforce your standards, you're communicating, I don't really mean it when I say they apply. What I really mean is they apply for some people, and it may not be you, or maybe. Right. And the last is continuity. This is something that is going on, and you both talked about sustainability. And sustainability is absolutely critical.
Steve, can I interject?
Oh, absolutely.
Comment? You know, the old adage here that what you do speaks so loudly, I can't hear what you say or write is very important, because people really pay much more attention to what you do as a leader and less to what you actually say, and even much less to what you print and put on the wall.
Right. Well, I'm going to tell a story about you. For another project, I was talking to somebody who's now over in Alabama, Jim Turner. And I talked to him, and I said, well, I was going to be meeting with you. Before I even said what, he said, I've got to tell you something about him that I remember. He said, you said to him, and I said this to you before, he said, David would say, throw the flag on me. Yep. If I make a mistake, I want to know about it. And I would say that, you said, to everybody. And so you set the tone and lived the tone, and it was remembered. And you're not there now, but they still quote it, and talk about it, and live it.
Right. But I got to add to that, because what Jim should have told you was there's another part to that, which is David says when something is going wrong, everybody knows it. You can smell it, you know. And then when you smell it, that's when you have to throw the flag and do something. And that's what I'm going to talk about, about what we're doing at MARTA. It's just not enough to know. You have to do something. You have to have courage to do something.
And that's not easy. And I think that the courage aspect of this is something that is a system of behavior too. So how do you hold leaders? What do leaders do who are accountable? They apply consequences. But Rebecca, just a model that we've used is we think what leaders have got to be accountable for is behavior that helps set the culture and affects others for future generations. I told a story last time about a physician who was really talented, but his behavior was so outrageous and disruptive that it affected cardiac surgery, disrupted everybody, and in healthcare that can lead to fatalities and complications. And I asked him how he got that way, and he said, well, I learned from the best. And he was taught behavior just as he was taught how to do his surgery. So what we say leaders have to do, our model, which is an extension of the 5 C's you saw before, is if you're a leader, you've got to model your values, but it's not enough. You've got to talk about it, make them part of your work. Every time I've gone into a Southern Company facility, you can't even practically cross the door without hearing about safety. It's just safety everywhere. I've seen it in Georgia. I've seen it in Alabama. I've seen it in Florida. And I've heard about it in Mississippi. I haven't been there yet. But talking about it is critical. And holding people accountable with consequences, but positive as well as negative. We honor people who live by our values here. That's part of it. And building a welcoming culture where you talk about it and then behaviorally show you mean it through your actions, not just your words. It's critical.
You know, it's interesting, Steve. I was thinking about what you're saying about safety. We had no problem, Sheldon, you remember, of firing people when they violated a safety rule. Because we knew the consequences could be death. We should have the same kind of commitment to the softer side of the business as well.
Well, I'm going to do something that you saw me do. I'm going to respectfully, as my colleague, the lawyer at practicing laws, I'm going to disagree. I don't think it's soft. I think it's really hard to do. And I agree with you completely, because what we see in power, utilities, nuclear, you create an environment where it's abusive, disruptive, people won't focus, and they may not speak up, and that can cause fatalities.
Terrific. Well, Steve, thank you for that quick kind of recap of just setting the tone here. And I'd like to shift gears a little bit and ask to hear from Shelton first and then David. You know, if you can talk a little bit about the expectations that your organizations have had for leaders, and particularly how you support them in doing sometimes the difficult things, the right things, but sometimes the difficult things, about encouraging that speak up culture and leading, leading by example. Can you share some stories with us and take us through what it would be like and the expectations that you'd have for leaders?
Yeah. So and so I've got my 2 colleagues here that and they're both attorneys. But the point I think is to link what both of them were saying. And at MARTA, it's hard to talk about this topic without first understanding our business. So we move 500,000 people daily. We like to say we connect people and create communities. We move millions of people a year, and you can't do that unless you can do it obviously safely. And that ridership experience, people have to feel as though they're safe, that they're secure. And one way that we make sure that happens is we created a campaign where everyone, all of the folks that ride our buses and trains and mobility vans, understood that a condition of that was to be able to ride with respect. And we had tremendous success from that, where we saw the number of customer complaints go down. We saw a lot of improvements in a lot of our key performance metrics. What we decided was, wow, if that can work, and another key component of that was that we told people, if you saw something happening, say something. our CEO says, wow, wouldn't that be great if we could have a similar focus internally? And there's that connection between the business and what David referred to as the softer side. Well, how can we enhance our culture and create the sort of environment where everyone feels valued, respected, engaged, encouraged to speak up? And so we created a culture change initiative, which we now call Work with Respect. And we didn't have to reinvent the wheel. We just had to remember that we have a very strong code of conduct. We've got clearly stated values and policies. We've got all those structural things. But what's the piece that's missing? And we says, wow, we have to create an environment and a culture where people feel obligated that if they see something, that they will say something, and even more, that they will do something. And it goes right back to everything we've already said. People will only do that if they feel as though they're going to be heard, if they feel as though you're going to respond, and if they feel that they can do that without it coming back to hurt them. So we're still in the early stages of it, but the outcomes that we are trying to achieve, and we're starting with leaders first. So we've had a pilot program that we took one of our business units through, starting in our next fiscal year, which starts in July. We're going to start, obviously, training all of our leaders. But the outcomes that we want is that we want a culture where people speak up. And that's only going to happen if we achieve these four following outcomes, where issues are dealt with directly and not indirectly. If people are dealt with fairly, if everyone, regardless of their title or position, understands that they're a leader and that this is a leadership issue. And then last but not least, we're not perfect. People are going to make mistakes, but people should be allowed to learn from mistakes and move on. So that, in a nutshell, is our work with respect culture change. Like I said, we are still in the infancy, but we feel great that considering the success we've had with our Ride with Respect campaign, which is externally focused, that, again, this is a business issue. It's just being applied to culture, which David referred to as the softer side, but for us, culture, business, culture, customers, culture, community, it's all the same. It's all the same. It's the success of the organization.
Now, Shelton, I was interested to hear you also extend this into the, Ride with Respect. In an earlier slide, and certainly in the earlier webcast, it was one of the statistics was the number of women on the subway in France who've been the victims of one form of abuse or another. And I wondered if you could take just a moment to kind of show me or tell us about the linkage between what that has done internally. And I know it's early days, but how has that Ride with Respect played itself out among your customers?
So obviously, there's a key to our success. One of the keys to our success is having riders and more riders, ride our buses, trains, and mobility vans. That is not going to happen if people perceive that experience is not safe or secure. That's part of the rider experience. And so obviously what we wanted to do was have the perception that we have a safe and secure system equal the reality. And as a result, we've got a number of key performance metrics which we're proud of, but the reduction in customer complaints about nuisance behavior on the part of other riders and patrons is down. And then one of the ones we're really proud of is the fact that although we're the ninth largest transit system in the country, and the fact that we only serve 3 of the 19 metro counties in the Atlanta metro area, our part one crimes, which are serious crimes, is probably 1 or 2 in the nation. So the Ride with Respect campaign not only gave us tangible results, but obviously it's having tremendous impact on making sure that people feel safe and secure, and that matches up with their actual experience. We want a similar, as a part of our internal culture change, we want people to feel as though they're valued, respected, engaged. We want them to feel that they can speak up, and we want them to come to work every day and work with respect. We like to say at MARTA, we're family. We just need to act like it.
Interesting. Well, listen, I have a couple of questions. I'm going to come back, but may I just ask David if you could share a little bit about the things that you personally led and expected your leaders at the Southern Company to be involved in, and how you approached this particular sharing and communication of what you expected from your leaders.
Sure, Rebecca, thanks. I'd be quick to add to your earlier comments. Like any company, Southern has a great statement of values and the things that we expect people to adhere to and behave around as a part of our value and culture. I think the key here, though, is creating an expectation amongst the entire leadership, and really, like Shelton said, all the way through the entire organization, that we create accountability for the behavior. How do we actually act? How do we actually implement what we say on the wall day in and day out? And that goes to accountability for how we live day in and day out and how we treat each other. I think there, in the leadership ranks, the particular formal leadership, the managers, supervisors, executives, I always tried to make sure they understood that I expected this to be a topic of conversation in their management meetings. Just like we're comfortable talking about budget issues or reliability issues, we ought to be equally comfortable talking about how are we behaving? Do we have any issues we need to deal with? Do we have people who are not leading in a fashion that we say we want to? When that occurs, you have to take, as Shelton said, you have to take action around that. There has to be consequences associated with consistent, inconsistent behavior. And those consequences can take a lot of different forms. They can be remedial training, it can be coaching, it can be help, but it has to take a tangible form of accountability. And I think the fact that I think Steve mentioned earlier, communication is so important here. We have to talk about this like we talk about the hard side of the business. And in many cases, we have to make clear what unacceptable behavior is. Because in some cultures, people come with different ideas. We have to create our own understanding of what acceptable behavior is. And then when people don't comport with that, we have to deal with that.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So, David, I have a question that's just come in, and perhaps I could ask you to begin to try to address this, and others may want to weigh in. We have a question here. Tamara asks how you help someone who's at the recipient of this unacceptable behavior feel comfortable that indeed there will be no retaliation. How do you foster that sense of trust in the system and trust in the leadership that action will be taken? Similar to what Shelton articulated a few moments ago, that issues would be dealt with directly and that people would be dealt with fairly. And I think that goes across the board to those who are receiving this behavior, and then also those who are need to be addressed. So, David, could you address that?
Sure. I think it has to be done carefully. I think Shelton made a comment earlier. It has to be deliberately done. You have to confront the situation. You have to protect the people who are willing and have the courage, as Shelton said, to come forward and throw the flag on somebody, in my vernacular. When they do, you have to make sure that you convince them that you have their back, you have them protected. You will not, if they want to remain confidential and anonymous, then we will certainly protect that. But you will investigate the situation. You will tell them what you have found, and you will make sure they understand the action that will be taken according to what you found in the investigation. Investigation has to be done thoroughly and completely and objectively, so that everybody, the accused as well as the accusor, gets treated fairly. But if you find that the behavior is unacceptable, you have to do something about it. That's the key. And the person who brings you the complaint needs to know and understand that you did something about it. Now, if that's obvious in the organization, for example, if you demote somebody or you fire somebody, then you don't have to do much communication about that, because that's obvious to everybody in the organization. And in fact, there's a big sigh of relief that goes out of the organization when you deal with the really bad actors. But Rebecca, the truth is, we all want this, and we'd like to have it today, but you have to earn this over repeated action so that people actually develop trust in you. That's why one of our main tenets at Southern was unquestionable trust. As a leader, you want the people who work with you to trust you. And they won't. You can want trust, but you have to earn trust. And trust is earned through behavior.
Yeah, I mean, Rebecca, I'm sorry.
No, please.
I can underscore everything that David is talking about. I'm the Chief Compliance Officer for Armada, and one of the first things that I did upon taking my position was take a look at, again, the processes. And Steve already alluded to the fact that everybody has these processes, right? Hotlines, ways to communicate that something has happened. But is a part of your process, how do you, in fact, communicate that I heard you, that what you have said has been heard, that we are going to have a thorough investigation, that we're going to communicate with you what's going on, and then we are going to take action that is consistent with the policies and practices, and that there won't be exception. And David, you know, we dealt with this over at Southern. It is this perception that, yeah, we hear you, but what about X?
What about old Joe? He's been here for 30 years. He gets great results. You're not really going to deal with him.
Right.
But when you deal with Joe, other people get a lot better.
Right. That's how you get that trust.
I want to add one element to this, and I agree with everything you both said. Is not that I would ever be employed by Georgia Power, Southern Company, anyway. I would be a public hazard. My wife can tell you that. But if I were, and I was walking down the street and saw a power line that I thought was a problem, and I worked at Georgia Power, one of the Southern Company things, you would expect me to speak up because it's a public hazard. Now, what's happening is that in our workplaces, we're learning that abusive, disruptive behavior is a public hazard because it detracts from concentration, speaking up, fixing, and focus. And I think one of the things we have to do is educate people that if you're affected by behavior that affects your performance, that's a business issue for all of us. It's not just personal to you. And you're speaking up just like you would for that power line. I think that's one thing. And the other thing is the idea, what you both said is right, is the see something, say something is terrific. It's just not enough, because it's see something, say something, and listen and act. And listen is critical, and act is vital too. And that takes time.
And to that point, you said, remember I said you have to say something, you have to see something, say something, and do something. And I'm not talking about the victim. See, in a lot of cases, people ought know that someone is the victim of some inappropriate behavior. And they say, oh, it's not my problem.
Exactly.
You know, and they put their head down and pray it doesn't happen to them. No, you have an obligation to your family member. That's what we're saying. Would you do that for your family member at home if you saw that they were, being abused or being harmed? Do something says that it's everybody's responsibility, it's not just the victims, but you have to trust. You have to step up and do something. That's the same expectation we have when you're on the train. It's not, if you're being affected personally, you're expected for the benefit of everyone to say something and do something.
And the sooner you do it, the better off the entire organization is.
Yes.
I always love the phrase react to smells.
Right.
We've all been in a situation where we smell smoke and we immediately began to investigate.
Right.
If we could create a culture that when they smelled inappropriate behavior, would deal with it, bring it up then. Think about how many, I would suggest that most corporate failures of the last 20 years would have been totally dealt with had somebody responded to the smell and somebody done something about it.
Mm-hmm. And you talk about the Harvey Weinstein. That wasn't a secret.
No.
We've now know that a lot of people knew that what had been happening for years. But no, I wanted to scream at those people. Why didn't you say something? Why didn't you do something?
Because that was their culture. They didn't have the inclusive speak up culture. They had absolutely exactly the opposite.
Right. Right.
Well, I think not only did they not speak up, in that particular instance, and perhaps in others, there was a group of people who were enabling that behavior for a variety of reasons that they thought made sense. So I know I worked in financial services for many years, and quite often we would bump into situations where you had a very, very successful financial advisor who was a rainmaker. And absolutely fabulous with clients and would chew through support staff with a turnover rate that would frighten most people. And the behavior continued, often because the organization would coalesce around enabling this very highly successful financial advisor to the detriment of other staff. So, there's a reason why in that first webcast, Steve made such powerful points around this is about an organizational culture failure in many cases. And so I think it's terrific to hear some of these examples of taking swift action. I love your phrase, David, about, you smell something and take action, before it becomes a fire. It's a smoldering issue, and so it's dealt with. We've got a question here. Someone had asked about how you deal with things when someone has not had the courage or has chosen not to do this in person and yet sends an anonymous letter or sends something or in some other way you should have known about this, was brought to some attention, but not maybe in such a direct way. How have these things best been dealt with?
I will tell you the way that we deal with it, whether it's anonymous or regardless of the way in which we are alerted to the fact, we have an obligation and a duty to act and do something. So we would conduct the investigation by, gathering facts, interviewing, witnesses. I hate to call them witnesses, but people that may have knowledge of that could help us understand the situation better. We will, if that means at MARTA partnering with our internal IT folks or internal auditing, the MARTA police, we gather as much information as we can. And even though we don't have an individual to respond to, we know that we have a situation that needs to be addressed, and then we put a plan in place and then execute against that plan to address the situation. We have the same obligation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that we live in a day and time where it doesn't matter how the issue gets raised, it has to be investigated and dealt with. No matter whether it's anonymous, through a letter, through an email. I used to tell my folks, send me the information anyway, throw the flag any way you want to, and I will respond. You have to.
Yep. Yeah. No, I think that's a great point. And I guess one of the things that you hear a lot about now is that some people say, well, particularly men who are in leadership positions, although I recognize that this speak up behavior belongs to all of us, regardless of your leadership position or individual contributor. But you have some people who now begin to say, I don't know what to say or do. I'm so afraid of saying much of anything for fear I will inadvertently, offend people. I don't want to hire women. I don't want to mentor them. I don't want to be in a situation where I could be in a situation where I had, I find myself being accused of things I'd rather not deal with it. So I hear that sometimes. And I wonder, you listen to podcasts and broadcasts and things. I wonder what your response would be in addressing this. What would you say to those leaders who voice those concerns?
we hear this so much.
We talked about this on a prior panel with Steve. I mean, I would be absolutely just incensed if we had not communicated properly the expectation of leadership, management, executives. You have to understand the value of dealing with diverse people, and you have to develop the capability to recruit, mentor, encourage, develop diverse people. I don't care whether they're female. I don't care what the diversity element is.
Right.
But you have to learn how to manage diversity in a productive way.
That's right.
And if you came to me and said you didn't want to hire somebody because they were different, I'd probably tell you all not to work here.
Yep. I like to use the 3 C's, and I found myself in a previous role having to coach the CHRO, who had indicated that he wasn't comfortable talking to females in his office with the door closed, et cetera, et cetera. We've heard this a million times. And what I told, what I coached him on was that you have to be comfortable doing it. As the CHRO, you have to be the role model. You have to set the tone. You have to be competent. And if you're not, we can get you some help. But you have to be courageous and to lean into an area that obviously is a leadership challenge for you. But it is not negotiable. It is absolutely not negotiable that if you're in a leadership, particularly in a leadership position, that you even think you have the luxury of carving out any particular segment of your workforce, particularly diverse segment of your workforce, and dealing with them different or not dealing with them. Not negotiable for a person in leadership.
I have a slightly different take on this. That's why I was smiling with the question. I'll tell you what it is, and I'm going to plead guilty. How's that? I think that, and I haven't practiced law for 30 plus years, but I think that lawyers for a long time told their industrial workplace clients, these conversations that can arise that deal with race and sex, religion, why don't you make sure that the people who talk about that are HR or later diversity and inclusion, because we don't want those leaders to say something that's going to create liability or be a problem. So the best thing is for them to avoid it. Now, I do think that happened. And so I think what that did is, A, it caused in many organizations, I'm not saying yours, but it caused sort of a cultural aversion to speaking about those issues, and people really don't know what to say. And part of what it is I think they need to know, the leaders need to know, no, this isn't optional. You've got to address these issues. It's part of your leadership competence. And if you don't have it, then you don't have the competence. Second of all, here are some things that this is why you got to be talking about it. And if you're not sure that you feel comfortable, let's work it out and talk it through, just like you learn any other skill. But what we're finding is how critical it is. And I just had an experience last week. I'll just tell you briefly about it. I'd been to an organization, a great organization, about a month earlier, talked to everybody. They heard a great CEO talking about his commitment to everything we've discussed. They were supposed to have the same conversation. I had the good fortune to go back and see them 6 weeks later. And I said, how many of you spoke up and talked about this to your direct reports? Because they promised they would. There were 15 in the room, 10 said yes, and about 5 said no. That's the problem, because they're not doing what you are both saying has to be done. Right. And if they don't do it, it falls apart.
Right. Well, let's be honest about that. You can think a little bit historically. Most of us didn't go through a curriculum that gave us any skill sets around this. We majored in some discipline. And in my culture, it was primarily engineering and accounting. And I can tell you, there was nothing in that curriculum that talked about how to manage personnel issues or anything. We have people who are comfortable with a discipline they know and are very uncomfortable in talking about these things. So we do have to acknowledge that we need to do some training and we need to do some coaching, but we need to talk about it. We need to admit that we're uncomfortable. That's the start. And then we can start working on it.
I agree with that.
Yeah, and again, though, I love you guys, but you can't. It's 2018, and if you're not, we don't want to make people feel. We don't want to point fingers and put people on a defense. But if you had a leader that pointed out that they had a weakness in any particular area, you would expect that person to speak up and say, "Hey, look, I need some help." And then we get that person to help to simply say, I'm going to treat my female direct reports differently than I'm going to treat my male reports is not. Absolutely, possibly not.
Oh, no, we don't disagree.
Well, then let me ask this question, because we do have a question that's come in from one of our attendees. And to your point, Steve, you know, you had a group of 15 and only 10 managers said they had communicated that message on down to their direct reports. Someone's asking about how you hold them accountable, how you leverage those mid-level managers to actually go all the way to the end of the cascading process.
Well, I'll tell you what I'm going to do on that one. I think David Ratcliffe has the answer for that. I'm going to pass this over to him. He's been there, right?
It'd be real simple. I mean, I would take those 5 people and say, why? First of all, why haven't you? Well, maybe they didn't have time. Or, do you understand clearly that I expect this to happen?
Mm-hmm.
Can we agree that it's going to happen within the next 60 days?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And can we agree that if it doesn't happen within the next 60 days, and oh, by the way, I'm going to talk to some of your teammates, some of the people who work with you to see if you've had this conversation. Real clear expectation. And I ask at the end of that, do you have any questions? Is there anything you don't understand about what I've just said? In the end.
Well, you know, the thing I love about that conversation, sorry, Sheldon, just be brief, is, you know, it's not legal speak. It's really blunt right out there. It's short. And early on in my career, I was told a couple of folks last week about this. I saw a CEO of a major division of a big company talk to his SVP of sales. This is before everybody had heard of the term sexual harassment. We knew it was wrong, but it wasn't a legal term. This goes back a long time. And he brought the SVP into his office and said, come here, I want to talk to you about something. And you can't do this. And he laid out what he can't. And if you want to work here, you'll stop immediately. Is there anything about this that you don't understand? And it was the clearest thing you could ever imagine. And it took about just that amount of time.
Yeah, and I just wanted to go back quickly to what David shared. That's not theoretical. I can personally attest to the fact that that is the way that things were done. But there was a little piece that David left out was he did not allow middle managers to have as a part of their narrative, well, David said, or David wants.
Sorry about that.
He would.
Exactly
David,
right.
Talk about getting incensed. If David heard that, oh my goodness, you got a lightning bolt sitting down from the 24th floor. You could not say, well, you have to do this because David said. You had to own it. It had to be you.
It's you.
And that's the part that some people had to make a decision that they couldn't stand leadership.
Well,
or he made a decision they couldn't stand leadership.
My point about that, Sheldon, you remember, was, look, we've said this is who we want to be.
Right.
This is what we wrote hung on the wall.
Right.
It's not something I said. It's something we all agreed that this is who we want to be.
Right.
If you don't want to be, go somewhere else.
Right.
Well, I'm fascinated by this conversation, and I think had I worked in an organization with any of you, I would have been impressed with the managerial courage here and the directness and the clarity of vision that you're talking about. I have a question for you, and I'm conscious of the time, and I'll look to see if there are any more questions that come in from the group. But what advice would you have to leaders who are struggling with some of these issues in the workplace now? Is there a piece of advice or wisdom that you might want to share with leaders and that we could work in these last few moments?
Want to go first on that one?
No. You want to go first?
Yeah,
I will. If you want to.
Well, I think in 30 seconds, while we have been talking about the big issues, sexual harassment, retaliation, discrimination, bullying, and speaking up about those, what keeps me awake at night is not the big ones. It is those non-legal, the things that make people feel marginalized, the things that make the smells, the things that hurt engagement, the things that we see end up in exit surveys and turnover. It is just that basic respect. You know, I didn't feel as though I was treated with the respect that I deserved as a team member. It is those non-legal, not the big ones. And so I would tell leaders, again, the organization has things in place for those big ones, but keep your and use David's vernacular, keep your eyes open and look out for those smells, for those little things that can take away and hurt just as well.
This is a hard question because basically it comes down to an individual making a decision to take a risk. I used to tell our folks, I don't want you to take risk at the top of a power pole or in a power plant. I do want you to take this risk because this risk says you care enough about the organization and about what we've said we want to be to risk challenging unacceptable behavior. And I understand that it's a risk. I understand it takes courage. But if you don't challenge it, then what you're saying to me is it's not worth it. You'll put up with the behavior. You don't care that much about the organization.
Right.
And everybody wants to work in the kind of organization that we all write and hang on the wall. So the accountability has to be there for us to achieve that. So take the risk.
Yep.
If you're talking about...
Oh, I'm sorry.
If you're talking about something that endures and is passed on. And I've worked with you a long time, Shelton, and just getting to know you, David. But I've heard of stories involving both of you doing what we've said that have been passed on and said, this is real. He really does this stuff. He means it. In our small company, I like to tell stories about people who've spoken up. Fortunately, not about these things, but I would want them to do the same thing. And when they've had ideas or suggestions, it's made us better. Mm-hmm. And I want them to know that I appreciate that and recognize it, and it's really, really important. So I think keeping together in the culture of stories when people did this and how it benefited everybody is really important.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I think you're raising quite a few really good points here, and I think the message that I'm hearing is how important it is for people who are in positions of power, like yourself in an organizational setting, to be especially sensitive to the fact that for many people, speaking up is a much bigger task, whether they come from, one element of diversity or another, or just culturally, or just who they are. It is a huge risk. And for managers who aren't sensitive to and begin to respond to the kinds of workplace environments that, to your point, Shelton, are not necessarily the big flames, or the house is on fire, but it's the daily inequities or inequalities or the daily instances of disrespect. And I remember earlier in the program, David had talked about, trust has to be earned. Well, respect should be given, but trust has to be earned. And these managers at any level, or these leaders at any level, need to feel as though they've earned the trust of their folks. That is for sure. Well, I'm going to have to close this conversation. I'm afraid I can only say I wish we could continue, but we have come to the end of our time, unfortunately. But I do want to thank all of you for choosing to be here, for what you've shared, for the examples of leadership in action. Just thank you so much, and I'm hopeful, and in fact, I know that our attendees today have gained from what you have shared, and I thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
You bet. So just a couple of things as we close out. This is a vitally important issue, and particularly for all of us who are in a corporate setting, but also for those who have families and folks we care about. So the Diversity and Inclusion Conference that's coming up right around the corner in June will be here in New York, and if you'd like to attend or learn more about it, please feel free to visit us and use the link there to learn more. I would also just mention to you that there are other related resources that are available to you, and I would encourage you to take advantage of those as you see fit. I will also say that we are going to distill the wisdom from all three of these webcasts, and we will have a publication in end of next month. But again, I would just like to mention that all three webcasts are available on demand, and they are in the public domain, and so I would encourage you to share this with others. So, as I mentioned earlier, we do take our feedback very seriously. We'd love it if you take just a couple moments and answer a couple of questions and help us make sure that we remain on point. Again, my thanks to the panelists. My thanks to those of you who chose to join us today for your insightful questions. Thank you very much. Take care now.